think we'll go ahead and we will get started. Thank you folks for being here. Thank you folks for being here. We really do appreciate it. And seems like it was just yesterday we were here last fall before the session, and now we're here for kind of talk about wrapping up the session. Paul and I will make some introductory comments, and then we'll open it up to you folks for any questions you might have or comments or concerns. To start out with, again, thank you very much for being here. We truly do appreciate it. We appreciate getting input from our constituents either before or after the sessions. When we're here before the session, we'd like to hear what's on your minds and what things you would like to see worked on. And after the session, talk about what did go on and what didn't go on. And in far as in the New Ulm area, one of the things that certainly we were hoping to get taken care of but didn't come to fruition was a bonding bill. That bonding bill would have helped the city of New Ulm and some of their projects, and I'm not sure just what street they were on, but Paul carried that bill in the House and I carried it in the Senate. It became apparent this year, probably fairly early in the year, that we probably were not going to have a bonding bill, but we were going to keep trying to work to get one. We never had a meeting between the Republicans bonding folks and the DFL bonding folks. We never had an actual meeting where we sat down and talked about projects and talked about what projects we wanted to get into the bill and things like that. It never come to that point. So we had two pieces of a bonding bill this year. The first one was a bonding bill. We're actually going to borrow the money to bond. And then the other one was a cash bonding bill where they take the money out of the general fund. The cash bonding bill was $71 million, so it was a lot of pet projects were in there, but they weren't really the substantial projects that you see in the regular bonding bill. That passed, as I understand, passed off the House floor, was sent over to the Senate, and as it ended up, 12 midnight came before the voting was done, and so that bill did not pass. The House usually starts the bonding bill and sends it over to us, and I know there was some negotiations between the House DFL and the Senate DFL, but they weren't coming together on a bill that they could get passed. So the bill never was passed off the House. They couldn't get the support for that with what was in it. It was never passed in the Senate. We had a Senate version, and that came to the Finance Committee. And in the Finance Committee, we tabled the bill. And that caused a lot of concern with constituents because they felt if we tabled the bill, there's nowhere for this bill to go forward. The reason we tabled the bill is we had absolutely in my district, I had absolutely no projects. And so to spend in this case, about $910 million and have no projects, and mine was not the only district. Several districts didn't have any projects, and there was not many rural projects in the bonding bill that other than some of the bigger rural communities. And so we felt if we tabled it, we would have an obligation or an opportunity to bring people to the table and try to get this put back together and try to get some of our bills in there. And as it ended up, it didn't make any difference. The bill got tabled because it would have had to go back to the House because it has to originate at the House. And we never did. We had some off the meeting type talks about what could be in the bill and stuff, but it never happened. So the bonding bill, we did not have a bonding bill at the end of the day, which means we'll probably have a bonding bill next year. And there was about $910 million they were looking at spending. There were some things in there that were good pieces. There was the HEAPR for the colleges. There was $60 million for the university, $60 million for the state colleges. That was certainly a good program. There was some other programs in there that certainly the PFA, the Public Facilities Authority for Sewer and Water, that does a lot of small community stuff. There was money in there for that. It was less than what we had hoped. It was quite low, but still there was some money in it that would have helped. But at the end of the day, the bonding bill just never made it through the process, and the cash bill never made it through the voting process. So that's kind of what happened with bonding. This is the end of the biennium, so we'll have to recycle those bills with new bills next year, but we will be checking this summer with any community that we had carried a bill for to see if they want us to carry that bill again next year to try to get some bonding money. Unfortunately, bonding sometimes it takes a while. I know there's some projects that I've worked on that it's taken, 5 or 6 bonding cycles to get the bonding money. Sometimes the triggers trip just right and you get it fairly early, but many a times you have to take a two to three runs at it to get it. So we'll keep working on them, and that's kind of what happened. So unfortunately, New Ulm's is still sitting on the table, but it's not on the cutting floor, so at least we can rejuvenate that next year. A couple of other things that I wanted to talk about is last year the religious exemption got taken out of one of the bills, the human rights bill. That got taken out. And it got taken out kind of, I wouldn't say during the middle of the night, but the sun wasn't up very far when that got taken out, unfortunately. And so most people didn't realize that had been taken out, including myself as a legislator, and several other legislators did not know that was taken out. We found that out this year. And so there was an attempt made to get that back in there. And I just want to let you know that I've been in the legislature now for 14 years, and this is the first time that I've seen the religious organizations combine together, get together, and come in and work on getting that bill, getting that exemption put back in. There were 15 different denominations, and the Catholic Church probably was the strongest leader amongst the bunch. But all the other ones were there, and they participated, and these were the top folks of each denomination. And they came in, and they came in very seriously. They did not come in to protest and do things like that. They came in to work to get something done, and they stayed there until there was an agreement. And this agreement came about 2 o'clock in the morning when this agreement was finally made. And so then the next day or the day after, it was passed off the Senate floor as agreed to, sent over to the House. They voted on it and they passed it as agreed to. And then we found out a couple of weeks later, and Paul was one of the people that discovered this. A couple of weeks later, that bill was still being sat on by the Speaker and by the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House. And that bill was not being forwarded because they wanted to use that for leverage for more negotiations. Well, Paul and some other friends of his, they got that bill over to the governor, and the governor did sign it that afternoon, so that's all back the way it originally was, and it got taken care of. But I just wanted to publicly tell you that if whatever denomination you're in, they were there to support you, and they did a very good job. And like I say, it's one of the first times I've seen the religious organizations step up, work together, and get this thing done. And so we really appreciate that, because without them, I don't think we could have got it done. So just hats off to them. Couple other things that think that got passed that were important is in the tax bill. We did have a couple of snafus from last year that had to be brought back in and straightened out. One of them got in the tax bill. The other one was the standalone bill that got straightened out, so that did get straightened out. Another thing that was in the tax bill this year was when schools remodel or build new buildings, usually they ask for an exemption on sales tax, and that has to come through the legislative body. And I think we had it was close to 18 schools this year that asked for that exemption. It looked like for a while with the budget that we were going to get for taxes that we were going to only do about half of that, half of their exemption. Well, as it ended up then toward the end, there was more money put in. And so all of the schools will receive the refund on their sales tax, like has been kind of normal the last few years. And I know we've already got people that are looking at applying for it next year, so hopefully that continues. So that was good news. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Paul when he gets done. Then we'll just open it up for questions and comments. Paul?
Well, thank you, Gary. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for turning out this morning. It's appreciated. A lot of familiar faces out in the audience, and we know you're interested in state government and what happens at the state. And it was a long, challenging biennium for us as Republicans. As I'm sure you know, DFL had complete control of state government with a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, and the governor's office. And the results of that are disappointing for us as conservatives. They entered the biennium with a huge surplus, depending on which figures you use, somewhere between 18, 19 billion dollars of money that was on the table, and they spent all of that last year and raised taxes on top of it by another 10 billion or more. And that increased the size of the state budget by 40%, darn near doubled. That is a huge increase in government, the amount of government and the cost of government, creating totally new departments that will require thousands of employees to be hired, and we believe much of it was beyond the pale. It just wasn't necessary, and they didn't really set any money aside for other issues that might pop up, and one of those that I'll identify is the emergency medical services issue. We have a real problem, especially in greater Minnesota, with our emergency medical services. The costs are going up, the volunteer pool is getting narrower, and it's harder and harder to keep these ambulance services operating the way they should across the state. You know, when you travel across the state of Minnesota, you expect that if you have a medical emergency or a car accident, that the ambulance is going to show up, and it's going to show up in short order. But that system is threatened because it's underfunded, it has some regulatory issues, and as I mentioned, volunteers and others are just an employment issue too. There was a small, what I would identify as a small amount of money at the end of the session that went to EMS, about 26 million, I believe. That will help, but I would call it more of a Band-Aid than a cure. It's just going to kind of keep the status quo in place for now, but we really need to look at this system, figure out what we can do regulatory-wise to make sure that it operates efficiently and effectively. Part of the problem is because it's the only way for some people to get around is that they get calls, emergency calls that aren't really emergencies. We need to figure out a way to deal with those in a less expensive fashion and staff those kinds of runs properly, and then better funding and better regulation. The need was identified at about $120 million, and we only were able to come up with this 26. When you look at that amount of money compared to what was spent last year just out of the surplus, 17 billion. I haven't worked out the exact percentage, but it's a way less than 1%. So it's a matter of priorities. We've seen with the DFL in charge that it feels like the priorities are metrocentric, that what's happening in the Twin Cities and the other population centers is much more important than what's happening in mine and Gary's types of districts. So with that backdrop, then we came into this session, and they predicted that there wouldn't be much going on. That it was there'd be a bonding bill and some fix-it bills to fix some of the problems that were created last year, but that really was not the case. Gary's already talked about the HRA situation that where those bills, the bill passed both the House and Senate, but then what normally happens is the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate sign those bills right away and send them to the governor. Well, in this case, they sat for a couple of weeks, and we discovered that they hadn't been signed and hadn't been sent to the governor, so we put up a big fuss, and that's one day when we did filibuster until we got the Speaker to actually sign that bill and the President of the Senate and send it to the governor, and he did sign it. It was so late in session that if that hadn't happened within a couple of days, the governor could have pocket vetoed that bill where he wouldn't have dealt with it, and then it could have died on the vine, and that would have been a real tragedy for something that passed unanimously through both the House and Senate. So the other thing, then there was a big dispute about the ERA. A version of the ERA had passed the Senate last year, and that version was kind of the traditional version, I would call it. But then they came to the House with a much different version this year that was much more controversial. And that, for instance, left age out of the equation, and we know that age discrimination is a real thing, but they decided that that was not necessary for whatever reason. Anyway, that failed. It was talked about in the House extensively. I think they tabled it 3 different times on the House floor before they finally tried to pass it, but it did not pass. There's lots of other issues to talk about today, but we want to kind of try and focus on the things that you have questions about. I'll just talk briefly about the bonding situation that Gary talked about quite a bit already. The cash bill that was passed by the House and went to the Senate but failed in the last minute of the session was just a cash bill. It was $71 million, did not include the things that we had been working on as far as general obligation bonds that would have borrowed the money to do these community projects like the Center Street lift station. So it wasn't what failed, that bill that failed really wasn't what we were after. The real bonding bill that should have been brought to the floor never even came to the House floor. They were not willing to sit down and negotiate. We had put a lot of time and effort into it. Our chair, Dean Erdahl, had worked hard and had some compromise, a compromise bill. The structure of it was put together, but it never was voted on in the House or the Senate. So with that, I think we can go to questions, and there's a lot of other things to talk about, but we want to talk about what you want to hear about. So if you've got questions, let's have at it.
John Lipke from Nicollet County, just thanking you both for your hard work, your accessibility. My representative and senator of the other party, they're not bad people, but they were much better people before this trifecta came. So, thank you.
Thank you, John. Go ahead.
Yes,
On the EMS situation,
yes.
it's my understanding that there's some sort of formula as to how this money is going to be spread out, and is that correct? And could you explain the formula, and more importantly, will any of that money go to Cortland or
Yes.
Newell? Or
I can't tell you the exact formula, but basically, as I understand, the formula that's been in will be the formula close to that will be used. As Paul alluded to, the request was for 120 million. The governor had put in 16. We ended up with about 24 million. And that's really just kind of a stopgap to get through this year. They've also appointed a task force, and that task force will be made up of many people from the EMS system, and try to come up with some policies that we feel are gonna work better than what we have working right now. And the purpose of that will be to make it fairer for our rural ambulance folks. And we realize next year we're gonna have to put more money into this to make it work. But what they wanted to do is get through this year and get that task force to kind of take a look and do some studies to see what we really need to do. Paul alluded to sometimes, people are calling and they just need a ride maybe to the clinic, or maybe need a ride to the drugstore to get their drugs. And it's really, right now, what happens is when that happens, the ambulance gets the call, they go out there. So they're looking at, one thing they're looking at doing is using a trial system or a pilot system to where you would have just a regular passenger vehicle, and one of the people, an EMS person, if there's a call, and they would screen these calls a little closer. So if it's not an ambulance type call, they could go out with a regular passenger car with one person and maybe take these people to the hospital or take them to their doctor's call, or to the drugstore or something like that at a much lower cost than what it is now with an ambulance. So things like that are being looked at. There will be a lot of things coming up in front of this this work group to figure out what direction this should go. We know we need to put some serious money in it. We know it's a serious issue, especially in rural Minnesota. And so when we do it, we want to make sure we do it as close to right as possible. But that's kind of what's happening. Yep. Other questions, concerns?
On the EMS thing?
Yes.
What happens if the ambulance is at that place that they just need to get a ride to the pharmacy?
Right now,
And then
most
there's a real emergency.
Right now, most ambulances, if they go out there and find out that they need to go get their drugs, they're gonna accommodate them.
So So
And-
the real emergency has to wait until.
Well, that could be an issue, yes. I mean, they don't do, you know, I think if you called in and said you needed an ambulance to go get your drugs, I'm not on EMS. I would assume they probably
Yeah.
wouldn't go out there,
Yeah,
but a lot of times they don't know that until they get there. Well, if you're already there,
yeah,
what do you say? So that's one of the things that they want to do with that pilot program, is to figure out how they could use a different structured system. Yes,
In light of what went on in the last hours,
yes.
first of all, I don't know how you guys do it. So frustrating, so belittling and demeaning, lack of respect for the system, for the process. It's overwhelming. I could say, on a personal basis, I have never encountered more of my friends, relatives and neighbors that I consider to be intelligence people that have completely thrown in the towel, have given up, to the point where they don't watch the news, they don't want to know what's going on because they've just been beat down. Are you feeling that?
Well, certainly to some degree. The end of session was the worst I've ever seen in this was the end of my 8th term, so 16 sessions. And it was, in my mind, not necessary. It didn't need to end that way. We've had bumpy endings before. So it's not unusual that some things get jammed up at the end and it gets a little rambunctious. But this was much more dramatic. And this bill, Gary brought it along, that we hadn't even had a chance to look at.
My understanding, it wasn't even online.
It wasn't available online. There were no printed copies available, and it includes a lot of things. There's a lot of things in there were things that had been either gone through committee or even made it to the House floor. But there are lots of things in there that we had never even seen, and I'm still waiting for it to be fully analyzed, because I don't know everything that's in there.
Do you
And
think
won't
there's
for
a
some
chance for
time.
a special session?
I don't think there's any chance of a special session. I'd be shocked if that would happen. There will be, we protested, we urged the governor to veto it, but he has signed it now, so it's become law. There may be a court challenge on the single subject issue. There is a statute that says bills have to be about a single subject. But when it went to court last time, the court said, well, as long as it's mentioned in the title of the bill, then it's okay. So they revised the title of this bill. At first it was like a page and a half. Now I think it's like 5.5. Just the title of the bill is like 5.5 pages just to include all those subjects to try and get by a court challenge. This is no way to run state government. John mentioned the trifecta. The Democrats were in charge of everything this entire biennium. They determine the calendar. They determine which bills come to the floor when. I serve on the Rules Committee, and when a bill we have deadlines. So there's deadlines built into the calendar when bills are supposed to be passed out of committee, and if they aren't passed out of committee, they're dead. Well, we had a record number of waivers come to the Rules Committee, where the bill author comes and the bill author doesn't even come, but they present it to the leadership and they say, "Oh, I didn't get my work done. Can you give me an extension?" So we had, I don't have an exact number, but more than I've ever seen, number of bills that were getting extensions, getting waivers from the deadline so that they could continue through the process. Well, that just jams everything up toward the end of session. And we have a limited number of days that we can meet in sessions, 120 days over the biennium. They wasted a lot of days early on, so when we got to the last week, they didn't have enough session days left to meet every day. So there were 2 days in that last week where we couldn't meet because they didn't have enough days left to meet. So we skipped 2 days in the last week. Plus, then when the Uber Lyft thing became a huge controversy, Senator Fateh basically shut down the Senate for 11 hours to negotiate that Uber Lyft bill. Normally those things are negotiated behind the scenes and the work continues until it's, an agreement is reached and it passes. But in this case, they shut down the Senate for 11 hours. They lost virtually another day and this is 2.5 days before the end of session. Just plain poor calendar and bill management. They brought bills to the, they're gonna say, oh, the Republicans did all this filibustering, that's why we couldn't get our work done. Well, the truth is, they brought controversial bills to the floor that they knew would elicit a lot of debate. They brought 3 gun bills to the floor when they knew they were not all 3 were gonna possibly pass the Senate. We wasted a lot of time on bills that were not going to become law. And in the meantime, we couldn't get the real work done that they had promised to do, like the bonding bill, where the Speaker of the House said early on, we're gonna come in, we're gonna do a bonding bill. Well, they didn't get it done. They didn't even get it to the House floor. Sorry to go on and on, but it was a very frustrating, disappointing session.
Just to follow up on that, this bill was originally the tax bill. It was about a 50-page bill. This one is 1,430 pages. There's 9 bills added to the tax bill, plus there's got to at least be 20 to 25 other bills that have pieces stuck in here at the end because they couldn't put them in the main bill because they knew they couldn't get the votes, so they stuck them in this bill here. There are 73 different articles in here that deal with different things other than taxes. We received this bill at 20 minutes after 11, and there was like 3 or 4 copies at the main desk. They were not online, and you couldn't get a copy. And you had till midnight to have this bill passed. And that's when the ruckus kind of started because, number one, the single subject stuff got thrown totally out of the window. I understand, like, if you have commerce, a single subject, if you had policy and finance together, that does happen. We like to keep policy separate from finance. Sometimes they get put together, it's still single subject. And this one here is probably, since I've been in the Senate, I have not seen a bill that has as many subjects in it as what this one does. And that bill was passed within just probably 20 minutes. This bill was done and passed. And nobody knows what's in here. I talked to the nonpartisan folks yesterday trying to get a summary of the bill, and that they said they're still working on it, and that they honestly don't know what is all in this bill. So it passes off the House, passes off the Senate, and the governor signs it, and nobody can tell me what's in this bill. The governor's office can't tell me that. Nobody can tell me what's in this bill. Kind of reminds me of the days when Obamacare started. They said, we'll pass the bill now and see what's in it later. This is the one that did that. 1,400 and some pages. So that's kind of, that was one of the problems we had that last night, is right in this bill right here. They went into conference committee about 8 o'clock that night, threw all that stuff in it. The conference committee had the majority of Democrats on it. They passed it. And the revisers could not get the bill put together and get enough of it printed. They finally got the bill together and got a couple copies printed. And the computers couldn't get it on the computer system, so you just had no way of knowing really what was in it. But that's what happens.
Regarding the senator that's in trouble legally,
Yes.
breaking and entering her mother-in-law's home, do you get information on that before the media gets it to us?
No, we don't.
So you're like me, you kind of got to watch the news to know what's going on?
Correct. And it's really pretty tight-lipped because she was brought in front of the Ethics Committee, which both the House and Senate has an Ethics Committee. She was brought in front of the Ethics Committee, and she had her attorney there, and she was told not to make any comments. You just sit here and listen. And so the attorney did all the speaking, and he has insisted she does not resign because he feels if she resigns, that's going to indicate some form of guilt. And so I don't think she's going to resign. I think she'll continue. I don't think she'd run again, but I think she will continue. I might be surprised, but I don't think she'll resign. June 10th is her next hearing, and I think whatever happens to that hearing might give an indication what she decides to do. And technically, even if she was found guilty of the first-degree burglary, that would be a felon, but we still could not expel her for that. I mean, if she's a felon, that doesn't mean you can't be a senator or a legislator. So she could stay, I mean, she could stay.
Or the president.
So, I mean, she could, you know, she could stay, and I'm not, that's up to her. She's gotta make that decision. And there's where they lost about a week, because they didn't have the votes, because they didn't know. First, they expelled her from the caucus, then they took her out of the committees, and then they took her off her committee chair. So they didn't know if she was gonna, you know, so when they didn't have the votes, it'd be 33-33, they couldn't pass nothing. So we lost about a week there. Then the last Friday in session, they got in a squabble amongst their caucus, and so that was a 7.5-hour stand, while we waited for that to get straightened out. And then Saturday, it was 11 hours, while we waited for that to get, Saturday, 11 hours, while we waited for the Uber Lyft to get straightened out. So we lost a lot of time in those areas. Yes,
Could you talk about the ag?
the what?
Ag bill.
The ag bill. Could you
Yes.
talk about the ag bill?
Yes, the ag bill was not as strong a bill as what it was last year, because last year was a budget year. But there was additional money put into, the new farmer portion, money put in there. There was some money changed around and some rules. What is a young farmer? What is a beginning farmer? The definition of that was changed in order to be more inclusive with farmers that are doing some of these vegetable crops and stuff like that. That was made more inclusive. They did expand AFRAC, which is the fertilizer deal. We increased the size of the board of directors for that. I think they added 3 new positions, and then there was 2 people from the crop production. One of those was taken off, and there was a health specialist put on, an environmentalist put on, and I can't remember what the other 2 were, not really related to that, but kind of guard dogs type. So that's what happened there. Broadband, which is under the Ag Committee, we run into some issues there. They passed some pretty tough legislation. Part of it dealing with prevailing wage, which is certainly an issue in rural Minnesota. Some of the other things is the reporting requirements are much stronger. And then there was some other pieces that they put in there, and right now it looks like we may not get near the money that, we have a $6 billion commitment from the federal government for broadband in Minnesota. And a lot of that's rural broadband. And right now, the way, if we can't change this language in some of these bills the next session, we're gonna lose out on a lot of that money, because the broadband providers just cannot meet the requirements. And when you take the amount of time to fill out all the new paperwork, and then take the prevailing wage piece of it, we're gonna have a hard time getting that money used in rural Minnesota. So hopefully we can get that revisited right away next session to get that, because we have a lot of strong providers out here. There's one in New Ulm that's very strong. There's several of those. And this is really gonna hamper what they're able to do because of some of this new regulation. But that's kind of a summary. There was a piece in the Ag bill, and it would allow this. There's actually a private zoo in Minnesota that's up in central Minnesota, and they like to bring reindeer in for their Christmas program and stuff. And so finally we got everybody to agree to allow that to happen. Then it got in conference committee, it got taken out. So that piece got lost, but that was kind of a real short 30,000-foot summary of what happened in the Ag bill. But there was some good pieces in there, and some good additional money, and some new language, so, yeah.
Nitrates too in the southeast. Money.
Yes, what happens is there's money for private wells in southeast Minnesota because of the nitrates. There's some money for that. There's some money for some additional research to be done. And I believe there was a study on spreading of the manure, time frame for that. I think there's a study working on that, yes. There was quite a few dollars put into various programs for southeast Minnesota for the water type issues, yep.
Yeah, it's important to remember that southeast geology is dramatically different than the rest of the state. The karst type topography down there means that water runs through the rock formations under the soil very quickly and into the groundwater. And so We've been working on issues down there for a long time. EPA got involved, as you may remember, during this last year, and that kind of lit the fire to try to do more. We've actually been, compared to other states, we already do a lot, and it's challenging, but we're working on it.
Yes,
I've been out of the loop for a while, so I'm just curious as to, with the surplus and other changes, can you describe what's happened in the area of human services for the elderly and disabled during this last session? Anything?
very little. The last year, we were able to get, in the final negotiations on the bonding bill, we were able to get 332 million for pretty much rural nursing homes.
Nursing home?
Yes, and so this year, that was kind of off limits. I mean, they just did not want to talk about more funding in nursing homes. For the handicapped and the disabled in that group, that's been a real struggle. It was a struggle last year, and we didn't make any headway to speak of this year. There were some dollars here and there for specialty type programs, but very limited. We did not get very far this year. We tried, but there was just not much movement.
Yeah, there was a strong effort to make it harder for the organizations that provide work opportunities for the disabled, but do it at a sub-minimum wage for what I think are reasonable reasons. And that could have changed pretty dramatically had the legislation passed. They would have required higher wages, and it would have probably shut down a number of programs, and that would have been a real shame. That was eliminated. That's not going to happen, so those programs can continue to exist and provide the valuable services that they do provide. We could all sing along, I suppose.
That happens to the best of us. Don't worry about that.
So those programs will continue and will not be impacted by negative legislation. So
I just know there's a terrible need for
Yes.
staff, and it's getting critical.
Yep.
And so I'm just wondering if there's anybody out there caring about that.
oh, it's a huge issue, and
Yes.
it is especially dramatic in rural Minnesota, and so we're pushing hard. We pushed hard last year. The Senate and the House pushed hard. We got some more funding, but this staffing issue is a really tough nut to crack, and now we've seen this pool staff situation develop where to fill in staff vacancies, they hire out of the pool, which is even more expensive and causes dissatisfaction within the staff and among the residents of the nursing homes. There's a lot of issues that need to be addressed, and Gary and I have both worked hard on nursing home issues and will continue, and the disability community too. We are very much in tune, but we're not in control. So,
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Dave Walker. I'm a police chief for the city of New Ulm. I'm also a Brown County Commissioner. One of the committees that I serve on is the South Central EMS, Emergency Medical Services Committee, and it represents a 9-county area, so that we've addressed the EMS bill, and I greatly appreciate the support that we've got on that. Again, we followed it closely. There's some good and bad with it. I mean, additional funding would have been helpful, but we do have a lifeline. This was one of the issues that, there's certain things that, and it depends what you're really involved in, what committees you're on, but the rural EMS, the basic life support, was very concerning for me, because I still don't know if some of those agencies are gonna make it. However, this was very helpful. I'm grateful to hear that this, and I, we were kind of following the language and everything regarding that this isn't a one-time funding option, that, hopefully there's future support, and I'm asking for future support, because some of these rural areas, I've talked with them firsthand in some of the real small communities. People aren't retiring from the ambulance service even though they feel they need to. Physically, they can't do it anymore, but there's no one to replace them. And they just realize what they're doing, the public safety support that they're offering. The other thing that has come up in it, with the police chief hat, the law enforcement hat, I'm very well aware of. So a lot of the transports that are going for mental health challenges, a lot of them are going by ambulance. And that's even part of the recommendation as far as best practices for law enforcement, because they're saying that's, when we're having a lot of those transports, literally in this area, it's very common to be going up to Fargo, going into Sioux Falls. Sioux Falls is the short trip, but it's a long distance travel, sometimes down to Iowa. And law enforcement's supposed to treat that, which it is, it's a medical issue, but what happens is you have basic life support that are responsible for that transport. So you have an individual that's supposed to be working someplace else and they're on call because they're volunteers, and now they're literally gone for 10, 12 hours because they have to do this transport. So again, the funding was I'm grateful for that. Our committee had talked about that. That was the lifeline that we needed. One thing that's a little concerning was that they basically dissolved the Emergency Medical Services Regulatory Board, the EMSRB. There's been some challenges in the past with how they're delivering their responsibility, but again, at the very minimum, I didn't think it was very, at that point, they're not very political. There's a process involved with it. Now setting up a department where literally that office is going to be, the commissioner is going to be appointed by the governor. Regardless, it becomes more political, and that's one concern I have. But I kind of covered a lot of area there. We are grateful for that support because it was very. I don't know what we would have done without it. And but at the same time, I'm hopeful that in the future we have additional support.
Well, thank you.
It's not going to be a one-time deal in our.
You bet.
standpoint.
Well,
But
thank you, Dave. Thanks for your work in this area. I know you've been very active, not just here in the community, but on a broader basis, and thank you for your work on it. And I share your concern about this new state department that was set up as part of this bill. It's gonna, for one, it's gonna eat up a good chunk of the funding that should be going out to do the work. And I'm not sure it's the best way forward. We argued against that on the House floor, but it passed anyway, and our work is not done here, we know that, and we will continue to advocate for both reform and funding in this area, because it's one of those basic things that people expect are gonna be there and available, and the system is at risk right now, especially in some of our smallest, least populated parts of the state. So thanks for your work, and we will be continuing to work on it, I assure you.
Thank you again.
You bet.
Yep, thank you. Yes,
Just talking to go off of what Dave was saying, you just said with the, that people expect those services, it goes for the utilities as well. We have a lot of, in rural Minnesota, we have a lot of wastewater and water plants that are at end of life. And, you're looking, our original wastewater plant was built in the 1975, and it was built with federal EPA dollars. And we've just done an infrastructure study saying that we're gonna need $115 million to upgrade that facility. We can't do that through rates. So, I appreciate, the support on this Center Street gravity. I hope it gets through. We need to get rid of that Center Street lift station because it's a safety issue. We're not allowing our employees to go in and even maintain it anymore. We have to do it from the outside. But do you see in the future any type of change? Next session, how is it going to be any different if it stays the way that it is? What can we look forward to, or obviously we can vote, but is there any chance for change this coming November?
it depends, you mean in the election, or are you? I think there's a very strong chance, but, we never know that until the day after. But certainly the House, hopefully they can win that. I'll let Paul speak on that. In the Senate, we'll probably have 3 to 4 opportunities. One will be with Kelly Morrison, she's running for Congress, and I think it's a pretty fair statement to say she very likely will win. And if she does, then there will be a vacant seat there. We have played in that seat before. It's a different seat than what we used to play in because of the redistricting. But there's a DFL member there in the House and a Republican member in the House, so it's a seat we could probably play in. There's another seat, Mitchell's seat, the gal from Woodbury, that's a pretty strong blue seat, so probably not playing there real heavy. Then there's a couple of senators that have some health issues that there's concern that they may be forced to retire, not forced by the system to retire, but just because of their health. So there'd be a couple there. One we could probably play in, the other one we wouldn't have any chance. So that's where we would be at on the Senate side, because we're not up for election this year. But Paul, you want to speak on the House side?
Well, we are working hard to identify candidates and raise money, and we are optimistic that we can win a majority in the House. But back to the issue that you're really talking about here, which is this infrastructure issue. And it's a statewide problem. The infrastructure that's in place is out of sight, out of mind in many ways, but it's deteriorating, it's aging out, and the requirements that are in place to upgrade, not only replace, but upgrade these systems to higher levels of performance, as you say, are tremendously expensive. And if a local community does it on their own, their utility bills go out of sight. And the smaller the community, the harder that is. So we need a system in place, and we've got, PFA actually is one of my favorite state agencies. I don't have very many that I like, but PFA, the Public Finance Authority, does a really nice job working with communities, identifying their needs, helping them design projects, and they have a priority list of who's ready for funding. Because a lot of times, we as legislators, we hear about a problem, we want to throw money at it right away. Well, in the case of infrastructure, if the groundwork hasn't been done to really design the system and figure out what needs to be done, throwing the money at it right away is not helpful, because then you're taking money away from somebody else that can actually use it tomorrow. So the PFA does a nice job of filtering that and making sure the money is used, that we get to them is used wisely. And I think it needs to be a higher priority. I mean, we need to recognize that the cost of doing these projects has skyrocketed for a variety of reasons, and the state really needs to step it up. And part of that is getting a bonding bill passed, and that's a lot of PFA funding comes from that. Frankly, the governor's bonding proposal this year was pretty good. If we could have gotten that across the finishing line, that would have actually done a pretty good job of doing the PFA, the water and wastewater and roads and bridges where the state should be helping out. I saw a couple other hands.
One of the things that bothers me these days is the divisiveness
Oh, thank you.
and the fact that, and it came up just now, well, when we take it over next year, we hope that we get the seats. How much does politics actually play into all this as opposed to actually thinking about what the problems are and working together to try to solve them? Because I don't like hearing that, the Democrats are doing this, well, we get it over next year, then we're gonna do this. I mean, that comes up and we have two different ideas, which is good. We need that. But if you never work together and we just always wait for whatever the favorite party is to do their thing, we're not solving everybody's issues. And I'd like to know how much you think politics plays into that, and do you actually try to work with one another and not be a firm Republican or Democrat and not really
And
listen?
that's a very good question, and I appreciate you bringing it up. There's a heck of a lot more negotiating going on, and there's a lot more working together than what you realize. Keep in mind one thing. The news media, they don't talk about all the things we've done and accomplished working together. They only talk about where the little bit of the fights are. And where those strong the different opinions are is spending money. So just give you an example. I've been criticized because last year I wouldn't compromise on the amount of money that was going to be spent. So from 2011 until the end of 2023, we grew the budget by $17 billion over that time period. last year, in 1 year for one biennium, they grew the budget by $40 billion. Now, if we're gonna compromise and get anywhere in the normal where we spend $3 to $5 billion of new money every biennium, I would have had to start it at a reduction of probably $30 billion as a reduction. In order, when they're starting at 40, if we're gonna get down to the kind of an average number that we usually have, I would have had to come along and say, well, we have to cut the budget, we have to cut the government by $30 billion. And then start at their 40 above and my 30 below and come to a compromise. There are a lot of things that we compromise on that you never hear about. But there's things we can't compromise because we're so far apart. The right is far to the right, the left is far to the left, and the middle is gone. And so that's been a real problem.
How
But
are you gonna solve it?
how do we solve it?
How are you gonna try to?
Well,
Because you have to eventually.
the way it gets solved is the grassroots, and people will disagree with me about this, but the way it gets resolved is grassroots. Meaning that when we elect people, we have to elect people that are gonna be able to work together. And I can remember when I first come in the Senate, we were standing, Jimmy Metzen, who was a strong DFL, myself a Republican, we were standing in the back of the floor and there was this discussion. And it went on for about 6 hours. Jimmy Metzen said to me, he said, Dahms, you take out your 4 strongest far to the right folks, I'll take out my 4 strongest far to the left folks, we'll take them out for lunch, we come back, this will be all settled. And basically, that's what it was. But those numbers are growing. And it's hard to work toward the middle to get the compromise. Now, if the dollars are reasonable, you can do that. Most of a lot of the policy stuff in the past, we've been able to come up with some compromise. But this last 2 years coming together on policy is really hard because we're such opposite ends of the spectrum. And so it's really hard to bring that compromise together. So all we can do is keep working on it, and that's about all we can do.
But going back to the politics part of it, sometimes if you say, I'm gonna compromise, that's bad for you. And that's on
Absolutely.
both sides, I'm not
Yeah.
criticizing one side or the other. Everybody, I mean, it's like compromise is a bad word these days. And what
Well-
can we as just general, sitting in the audience, public do about that?
Well, you know, the way I work in the legislature, I don't talk about compromise. I talk about working together to find a solution that both sides can live with. Because we have our disagreements, we have different philosophies. I believe government should be smaller, more efficient, and other people believe that government can be the answer to every problem. We just create another department and we can fix everything. So we disagree on that, but when it comes to problems that need to be solved, if we sit down and work it out, we can often find solutions that we can both live with. And a lot of that, I agree with Gary, a lot of that does go on, but it doesn't get much attention. But we've seen 2 things. We've seen more radical candidates getting endorsed on both sides of the aisle. For whatever reason, you can identify different causes of that. Part of it may be what's happening at the national level. Part of it may be the social media. Part of it is the way the news coverage has now become more partisan. It depends on which channel you listen to. All those things have kind of added to this extremism, and that extremism has brought more extreme candidates to the table, to the ballot. The other thing that's happened pretty dramatically in Minnesota is we've seen this rural and urban divide created, where greater Minnesota is strong Republican, and the population centers, the Twin Cities, Duluth, Rochester, even Mankato, have become dominated by DFL candidates. Well, we have differences in issues regionally. What's important to us in greater Minnesota is not the same thing that's important to the folks that live in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so that tension has increased. When I first was elected to the legislature, we had pockets of DFL representation in greater Minnesota. They were out there. And we had, not so much in the inner city, but in the suburbs, we had pretty strong Republican enclaves, whatever you want to call it, a representation in the at least in the near metro part of the state. That's gotten more and more divided, and how we bridge those gaps is really challenging. A good friend of mine, Frank Hornstein, DFLer, who just retired this year, We worked together on transportation a lot. He was chair when I was lead. I was chair when he was lead. We didn't agree on everything, but we usually figured out a way to get things done. He told me many times over the last 3 or 4 years, I'm not liberal enough for my district anymore. He knew that he was going to be challenged by a more liberal candidate that was probably going to knock him out. So and I don't know for sure if that's why he decided to retire now, but I know that he was concerned about that. It's not healthy.
One more question, and then we're gonna have to,
This is just a comment. I was at the farm thing where you were at with Nick Friends, and I saw him replace one orifice with the other, and what came out was absolute crap.
well,
Negative way.
just real quick,
Real quick, just on the energy front?
yes.
Anything as far as, you know, we're going to that 100% renewable energy standards and so forth. Anything coming down the line with that, electrification, Eco Act?
Well, one very interesting thing that happened this year is they've decided to ease the permitting process for new transmission lines and green energy facilities that are applying to for a building permit or for the permit to go ahead. That's not bad. That's probably good if we're going to, especially going to try and reach the goal that you mentioned. But to me, it's an admission that our permitting process is so cumbersome that we can't get stuff done. And it's not just true in the energy sector, it's true throughout state government, where getting a permit to do something in Minnesota takes 4 or 5 times as long as it does in bordering states. So hopefully this is an example of how we can reform permitting throughout state government. Otherwise, in the energy front, I'm certainly no expert. The goals are there. They're going to be extremely difficult to attain. And, you know, Minnesota's contribution to the CO2 problem on a percentage basis is very tiny. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do better. We should and we will. But moving too far too fast can also make our economy slow down. And I often say it's hard to be green when you're in the red.
It's, we're gonna have to look at some alternative ways to create energy also. We did have, in the energy bill we had in the Senate, when it was taken out of conference committee, was increasing more for using water based creating energy, and then for nuclear. And the nuclear people, you know, some people get pretty nervous, but with the new nuclear systems, it's being found to be very, very efficient. And so we had that in the Senate energy bill, but it got taken out at conference committee. But we're gonna have to look at some alternative things also. So unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. We've got the next one coming up shortly. So thank you very much for coming. We really do appreciate it. And if something comes up that you got questions or concerns, need some help, get a hold of our offices. We're certainly willing to help you. Paul and I both have newsletters, so if you want to contact his or my office to get on our newsletters, certainly feel free to do so. During session, we send them out once a week. During the off session, usually about once a month. And so, again, thank you for being here. And Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, I repeat the thanks and your interest in what's happening in state government. I'll end with the same thing I end with every time I speak lately, and that's about voting. There were a number of changes in the election laws that were made this last year that make it easier to make sure your ballot is cast. I didn't agree with all those changes personally, but I believe everyone needs to cast their ballot, and every political perspective should look at those tools and use those tools to get people to get out and participate in the system. So if you know people who have been kind of lazy about their voting, you know, show up when it's easy but don't always vote, encourage them to, you know, use the absentee system. It's available. Vote early. It's available. Vote. A good turnout is good for all of us, I believe, and we'll hopefully have better results if more people vote. With that, thanks again and have a great day. Safe travels.
Thank you.